All right, so you've given us quite the challenge this time. We're going to be looking at animal breeding and seeing if those principles could theoretically apply to humans.
Yeah, specifically for creating better soldiers.
It's,
It's an interesting challenge for sure.
yeah, it's like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right?
Hmm.
But we have a textbook on animal breeding and genetics to help us break it down.
Yeah, we're going to be taking a deep dive into this topic and see where it takes us.
So let's start with the basic concept of heritability.
Right.
This is basically how much of a trait is determined by genetics.
Yeah, think of it like this genes are like a blueprint for a building,
Okay,
but the environment is like the construction crew and materials.
I see.
So a highly heritable trait like, say, coat color in dogs is like having a really detailed blueprint.
So the construction crew can't really mess it up too much.
Exactly. Even with subpar materials and workers, the final building will still look pretty close to the blueprint.
So if we were aiming to enhance soldiers, for example, we'd want to focus on traits with high heritability.
Right, because those traits would be easier to influence through selective breeding.
So things like strength, agility, maybe even intelligence.
Yeah, but even with physical traits, it's not always so simple.
Okay, how so?
Take height, for example. It's highly heritable, but nutrition also plays a significant role.
Right. If someone doesn't get enough to eat, they won't reach their full potential height.
Exactly. And when we start talking about more complex traits like courage or strategic thinking, the interplay between genes and environment becomes even more difficult to untangle.
That makes sense. So heritability is important, but it's only part of the story.
Definitely. Now, humans have been shaping animal genetics for millennia, way before we knew anything about DNA.
Yeah, it's amazing what breeders have accomplished. Just look at the variety in dog breeds.
Exactly. Our textbook mentions this guy, Robert Bakewell.
Okay?
He was a farmer in the 18th century who revolutionized sheep breeding.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, he meticulously selected sheep with desirable traits like better wool and meat.
So he was basically doing genetic engineering before it was a thing.
Yeah, kind of. He laid the groundwork for modern breeding practices without even knowing about genes.
It makes you wonder what Bakewell would have accomplished with today's technology.
Right. We've gone from observing sheep to analyzing their entire genetic code.
Speaking of technology, modern breeders have a lot of tools at their disposal.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the most important is estimated breeding values, or EBVs for short.
EBVs. That sounds interesting. What are those exactly?
It's like a genetic GPA for animals.
I like that analogy.
It predicts how likely an animal is to pass on desirable traits to its offspring.
So it's not just about how the animal looks itself, but its potential to produce offspring with those same desirable traits.
Exactly.
Okay.
For example, let's say you're a cattle breeder and you want to produce cows that give more milk.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just pick the cow that produces the most milk. You'd want to know its EBV for milk production.
So you could pick a bull that will produce daughters with even higher milk yields.
Exactly. It's all about maximizing the genetic potential of your herd.
That makes sense. But how do breeders actually calculate these EBVs?
Well, it's a complex process. It involves a lot of data analysis and statistical modeling.
So the more data you have, the more accurate the EBV.
Exactly. We need information about the animal, its parents, its siblings, its offspring.
So it's like a family tree for genes.
Yeah, you could say that. And the more branches we can trace, the clearer the picture becomes.
That's fascinating. So are there different ways to gather all this genetic data?
Oh, absolutely. There are various selection methods. The simplest one is called mass selection.
Mass selection. What's that?
It's basically selecting animals based solely on their own performance.
So for example, a horse breeder might select the fastest horse for breeding regardless of its pedigree.
Exactly. But mass selection has its limitations. It doesn't take into account the genetic potential that might be hidden in an animal's family tree.
Right, so you might miss out on some valuable genes if you only focus on the individual.
Exactly. That's where the animal model comes in.
The animal model.
Yeah, it's a more sophisticated approach that incorporates data from an animal's relatives.
So it gives you a more complete picture of the animal's genetic potential.
Right. It's like recognizing that even a seemingly exceptional individual might carry hidden genetic risks, or that a less impressive individual might have the potential to produce outstanding offspring.
It's like a genetic background check.
Yeah, you could say that.
So it's about balancing individual performance with a broader understanding of their genetic lineage.
Exactly. And it gets even more advanced with genomic selection.
Genomic selection.
This method analyzes DNA markers to predict an animal's genetic potential.
So instead of just looking at the animal's performance or its family history, You're actually looking at its DNA.
Exactly. It's like having a crystal ball that can reveal an animal's genetic strengths and weaknesses even before they're physically expressed.
That's incredible. So we've gone from observing physical traits to analyzing pedigrees to now analyzing DNA.
It's a testament to how far we've come in understanding genetics.
But how does all this relate back to our hypothetical scenario of breeding super soldiers?
Well, if we were to apply these concepts to humans, which is purely hypothetical, of course,
Of course.
we'd need to consider the same factors. What traits are we trying to enhance? How heritable are those traits?
And how accurately can we measure and predict them?
Exactly. And what selection methods would be most effective?
It sounds like a massive undertaking, even in a purely hypothetical sense.
It would be, but the concept of shaping human potential through breeding is certainly thought-provoking.
It is, and it raises questions about what constitutes a super soldier in the first place.
Right. Is it purely about physical prowess? Or mental agility, resilience, ethical decision-making equally important?
That's a great point. It's not just about creating physically superior individuals. It's about understanding the complex interplay of traits that contribute to overall performance.
And of course, the ethical implications of such an endeavor are enormous.
Exactly. We're talking about people's lives here, not just livestock.
Right. And that brings us to another important concept in animal breeding selection response.
Okay, selection response. What's that
Right.
all about?
Essentially, it's the difference in performance between one generation and the next.
So, for example, if you were breeding rabbits for jumping ability, selection response would be the increase in average jump height you see in each generation.
Exactly. The bigger the selection response, the faster you're making progress towards your breeding goal.
So what factors influence selection response?
Well, the three main ones are heritability, the accuracy of our breeding value estimates, and the selection intensity.
Okay, break that down for me.
If a trait is highly heritable, we can make faster progress through selection.
That makes sense.
And if our EBVs are accurate, we can confidently select the best parents for the next generation.
So far, so good.
But selection intensity is where things get interesting.
How so?
If we only select a very small percentage of animals for breeding, say the top 1%,
Okay.
we might be missing out on some hidden genetic gems in the slightly less impressive individuals.
So it's a trade-off between focusing on the elite and maintaining genetic diversity.
Exactly. You want to pick the best of the best, but you also don't want to narrow the gene pool too much.
That makes sense. How does this concept translate to the super soldier idea?
Well, it raises some important questions. If we were hypothetically trying to enhance human traits for combat,
Yeah.
do we focus intensely on a select few with seemingly ideal traits? Or do we maintain a broader pool to preserve genetic diversity?
And what are the potential consequences of each approach?
Exactly. These are questions that would need to be carefully considered.
It seems like even in this hypothetical realm, the ethical implications are impossible to ignore.
They are. But before we delve into that ethical minefield,
Yes?
there's one more technical aspect of animal breeding we need to unpack.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Inbreeding.
Ah, yes. Inbreeding. The stuff of royal families and, well, questionable breeding practices. What's the scientific take on inbreeding? And why is it so important in this discussion?
Inbreeding essentially means mating-related individuals. And while it can be used to concentrate desirable traits,
Yeah.
it also increases the risk of harmful recessive genes expressing themselves.
So it's a risky strategy.
It can be. Think of it like this. Every individual carries a few potentially harmful genetic mutations.
Okay.
In a large, diverse population, these mutations are unlikely to cause problems because they're often masked by healthy genes. But when related individuals mate, the chances of their offspring inheriting two copies of the same harmful mutation increase significantly.
So inbreeding can lead to health problems.
Yes. And not just in the short term, it also reduces genetic diversity within a population, making it more vulnerable to diseases and environmental changes.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is, and that's why maintaining genetic diversity is so crucial, especially in a hypothetical scenario where we're trying to engineer humans for specific roles.
It's like super soldiers.
Exactly. A population of super soldiers all susceptible to the same disease would be a disaster waiting to happen.
It sounds like we're walking a tightrope between maximizing desirable traits and preserving genetic diversity.
We are. And if we were to even entertain the idea of applying animal breeding principles to humans,
Yeah.
we'd need to proceed with extreme caution. We'd need to carefully consider the potential consequences, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It certainly does. Yeah, it really makes you think, like, Even just thinking hypothetically, all the downsides are kind of scary.
Yeah, definitely. Because with animal breeding, at least you can control the environment, right?
Yeah.
But with humans, it's a whole other story.
Yeah, exactly. Humans are way more complex. We're not just talking about physical traits.
Right. It's not like you could just breed for speed and strength and call it a day.
Exactly. You've got to think about things like leadership courage, ethical decision making.
And how do you even measure those things?
Exactly. Those aren't like physical traits that you can easily observe and quantify.
It's like trying to breed for something that you can't even really define.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So even if we were to entertain this thought experiment a little further, how would we even begin to identify individuals with the potential to be super soldiers?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not like we can just give everyone a genetic test and pick the ones with the best scores.
Right. We'd have to start by defining what super soldier even means.
Yeah, what are we actually looking for? Are we talking about physical strength and endurance?
Or tactical brilliance?
Psychological resilience?
The criteria would be incredibly complex.
And even if we could somehow come up with a set of criteria, how would we actually select for those traits?
Yeah, it's not like we can just put potential recruits through rigorous military training just to see how they perform.
That'd be unethical.
And impractical. So we'd have to rely on indirect measures.
Like what?
Maybe psychological assessments,
Simulations?
analyzing family histories for patterns of military success.
It sounds like a really long shot.
It would be.
Yeah.
And even if we could identify individuals with certain desirable traits, there's still a huge element of chance.
Right. Genes don't always express themselves in predictable ways.
Exactly. Environmental factors, upbringing, training, all of these things play a role in shaping an individual's abilities.
So you could have someone with the perfect genetic makeup for a super soldier, but they end up being a total pacifist.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. So even if we set aside the ethical concerns,
Which are huge, by the way.
yeah, the practical challenges seem almost insurmountable.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. So in the real world,
Yeah.
the idea of breeding super soldiers remains firmly in the realm of science fiction.
Okay, so this deep dive has been an eye-opening exploration of animal breeding and its potential application to humans.
Yeah, we've learned about heritability, EBV's selection response.
In breeding.
It's been a lot to take in.
It has. But what does it all mean for us? You know, the regular folks who aren't trying to create super soldiers.
No, I think it's a reminder that while we can learn a lot from animal breeding, applying those concepts to humans raises a whole host of ethical and practical challenges.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just picking and choosing the traits we want.
Exactly. Humans are much more than the sum of their genes.
Our experiences, our choices, the environment we live in, all of these things play a role in shaping who we are.
So while we may not be able to breed super soldiers anytime soon,
Thank goodness.
I think this exploration has given us a lot to think about.
It definitely has. And as our understanding of genetics continues to advance,
Right.
these conversations about the responsible and ethical use of this knowledge will become even more important.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we've spent all this time talking about super soldiers.
Right, and how they're not really a feasible thing.
Yeah, but even though this is all hypothetical,
Yeah.
it seems like there's still some real-world relevance here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this whole discussion has really highlighted the power of genetics.
And the responsibility that comes with it.
Exactly. Because even if we're not creating super soldiers, we're still making choices that affect the genetic makeup of future generations.
Like with genetic screening and gene editing.
Exactly. Those technologies have the potential to do a lot of good.
But they also come with some serious ethical dilemmas.
Right. So I think this deep dive has been a good reminder that we need to be having these conversations now.
Before these technologies become even more powerful.
Exactly. We need to figure out where we draw the line.
Yeah. What are the limits of genetic manipulation?
Right. What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended?
These are tough questions, but they're important ones.
They are. And they're not just for scientists and policymakers to answer.
This is something that affects all of us.
Exactly. So I encourage everyone to learn more about genetics and the ethical issues surrounding it.
Yeah, because the future is coming, whether we're ready for it or not.
That's for sure.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of animal breeding and its potential applications to humans.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.